we can get started here. Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future program here, and it's so great to see a full house. Looks like standing room only here, and larger numbers, I believe, are watching now on our webcast from our website, newamerica.net, and we'll be viewing this on C-SPAN, which is among the cameras recording here today, which means this is on the record. And at the end, Larry Summers will take questions. And what I'll do, though, and I'll try to remind you at that point, is to stand and identify yourself, and also wait for the microphone. There's a handheld microphone that'll go around, because we want to make sure that everything gets on to all these video feeds. So we're very pleased to host Larry Summers today, who will describe how the government can facilitate the evolution of broadband connectivity to create jobs and sustain economic growth. It's a testament to the growing economic importance of broadband and increasingly of mobile internet access that the president would send his chief economic advisor to explain the administration's initiative to reallocate large portions of the public airwaves for wireless broadband. Here at New America, our Wireless Future program, our Open Technology Initiative, and economic growth programs have all for years argued that universal and ubiquitous broadband connectivity is the essential infrastructure for the 21st century economy. Broadband is an input into everything else, and increasingly it will be the diffusion of high capacity and mobile broadband that will prove critical to improvements in productivity in every other sector. For many years, the mission of my program here has been to open the vast wasteland of unused spectrum capacity for broadband innovation. Spectrum is the oil of the information economy, and the airwaves are a publicly owned resource that need to be allocated to maximize the public interest. We therefore applaud the administration and the FCC for taking up this challenge and for setting such an ambitious goal to open new bands for more flexibly licensed and unlicensed use. The administration's emphasis on reallocating federal bands for shared and opportunistic access and for transfer to commercial licensees where feasible holds particular promise, we believe. We know that the military, the FAA, and many other federal agencies will continue to require priority access to many of the most valuable portions of the public airwaves. But since most of this capacity is unused at most times and places, we strongly support the administration's efforts to develop the policies and resources that can take advantage of smart radio technologies and open these bands to the private sector for shared use in the future. Finally, I'd like to thank not only Larry Summers for his attention to this issue, but also the leadership of the Commerce Department's NTIA under Larry Strickling, who is here with us today, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under the nation's Chief Technology Officer, Anish Chopra, who is also here today, and to thank them for supporting the FCC's National Broadband Plan. I know Julius Janikowski had wanted to be here, and some of his key staff is. And it's going to take that team effort to move these issues to the top of the nation's economic and technology agenda. Larry Summers hardly needs an introduction, but for the record, he serves as Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and as Director of the President's National Economic Council. Previously, he has served as Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton, as Chief Economist at the World Bank, and as President of Harvard University from 2001 to 2006, where he continues as a tenured professor. So Larry, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to come to the New America Foundation. You know, the story of the subject spectrum auctions that I'm going to talk about today is that one should give inspiration to researchers in think tanks and academia who run into trouble with their ideas. This idea started, at least to my knowledge, with work that Ronald Coase did in the late 1950s. In the aftermath of Coase's work suggesting that spectrum be auctioned or allocated by the market, two FCC commissioners declared that he was as likely to get his policies adopted as the Easter Bunny was to win the Preakness. Tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars later, around the world, Coase is looking pretty good, and those two FCC commissioners are not looking so forward-looking. And besides that, Coase was inspired by his work in this area to invent the Coase theorem, and the Nobel Prize Committee was inspired by the Coase theorem to award Coase the Nobel Prize. So those of you with ideas that have not yet caught fire, I implore you to persevere. The lags are, as Milton Friedman used to say, long and variable, but there is the potential that today's crack-brained academic idea is the centerpiece of tomorrow's policy. And that is certainly the case here. I come today to announce the President's plan to nearly double the amount of spectrum available so as to unleash the innovative potential of wireless broadband. This initiative will catalyze private sector investment, contribute to economic growth, and make revenue available to the federal government and help to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It was developed by a team that includes the Office of Science and Technology Policy, represented here today by the President's Chief Technology Officer, Anish Chopra, the Department of Commerce, represented here today by the NTIA Administrator, Larry Strickling, the Office of Management Budget, and members of my staff, Phil Weiser and Jason Furman. I want to thank them and the rest of the team for their hard work. I also want to acknowledge the hard work and leadership of FCC Chairman Julius Janikowski and his team, which put together the National Broadband Plan and proposed a set of steps that contributed to the initiative that I'm announcing today. But first, put this all in some perspective. The President's economic strategy is grounded on the idea of building a stronger foundation for future prosperity and growth. Yes, when the President took office, he inherited a financial crisis of once in every 75-year magnitude, and the first priority had to be lifting the economy out of that rut. But even as he did so, it was essential to lay a foundation for future prosperity. That's why the Recovery Act included more than $100 billion in innovative investments to help Americans use energy more efficiently, to create high-speed rail to connect our cities, to improve health information technology so as to create jobs while transforming our health system. And that is why the Recovery Act also made substantial investment in bringing broadband to unserved and underserved areas across the country. That is why, subsequent to the Recovery Act, the President has undertaken a range of private sector initiatives, from the National Export Initiative, directed at doubling exports in 5 years, to the innovation strategy aimed at fostering and catalyzing private sector innovation. At their root, these initiatives involve government acting as a catalyst for private sector investment and growth. To be sure, this is not a new idea. The story of American economic growth is often told as a story of entrepreneurs, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and so it is. But it is also a story of government actions to assure the necessary foundational investments for economic growth. In the 1860s, as war raged between North and South, Abraham Lincoln worked to realize another vision that would unify America from east to west. How did Lincoln and Congress, immersed in civil war, manage to build a railroad spanning the American continent, performance-based government bonds, extensive grants of government-owned land, and competition among the major rail companies? Traveling across the United States had required a journey of several months.
After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, it could be done in a single week. Public action, private investment. The same principle motivated one of the great educational achievements in our history, the establishment of land-grant colleges and universities. Again, public property. The Morrill Act of 1862 transferred a total of 11.5 million acres of federal land to the states to establish educational institutions. Together with the expansion of this effort in 1890, these land grants broadened access to higher education, just as the demands of a rapidly industrialized society called for more highly skilled workers. Today, 3 million students are enrolled each year at the 104 land-grant institutions across the country, and the research that takes place at those universities transformed American agriculture and spurred the transformation of the American economy over the course of the 20th century. Public action, private investment. Today, I'm here to discuss a new avenue, continuing in that tradition, the President's initiative to unleash the potential of wireless spectrum. Opening up spectrum will, and I'll detail this a little later, create the foundation for a new private sector investment and economic activity in mobile broadband and a range of other high-value uses that would not have been possible without the coordinating and organizing role of government. Public action, private investment. But there's another reason why reforming our spectrum policy is so important. This is something that goes deep into political economy. Mansur Olson famously wrote about the tendency of stable democracies to become sclerotic as the accretion of entrenched interests blocked progress. In a similar vein, the great economic historian Alexander Gerschenkron took as his central theme the ironic advantages of what he termed economic backwardness. Gerschenkron suggested that countries that were late to industrialize were sometimes able to bypass many of the dead ends and outdated practices that encumbered the early industrializers. These countries, he stressed, could start with an open canvas, free from what John Stuart Mill once called the slavery of antecedent circumstances. Spectrum policy reform is especially important to our competitive position because it addresses a cutting-edge area where we would be otherwise at a disadvantage, because our early lead in developing and disseminating technologies of yesterday leaves us ill-equipped for the technological challenges of tomorrow, because so much more spectrum has been spoken for here than in the emerging nations that we find ourselves competing with. The most important innovations economic history suggests are not those that simply enable an existing task to be done more cheaply or more rapidly, but rather are those innovations that create possibilities that could not previously have been imagined, and with them create the industries of the future and millions of new jobs. The steam engine, electricity, the automobile. These were technologies that did not just permit existing products to be produced better or more cheaply, but opened whole new economic vistas. We are, I would suggest, in the middle of another one of those revolutions right now. The information technology revolution is redefining what infrastructure is all about. For millennia, progress in infrastructure came from the more effective movement of commerce in goods and services. But in the digital world, we are concerned with the movements of images and ideas, bits, rather than mass. We are now in the midst of the third wave of the Internet's development, mobile broadband, and we have only begun to glimpse the benefits of that revolution, exemplified by smartphones, netbooks, and the applications that run on them. Perhaps the major threat to this vision is what could be called spectrum crunch. Today, we are able to use smartphones and cellular internet connections because of the actions started in the early 1990s that leave us with just over 500 megahertz of spectrum for mobile communications. But this spectrum is becoming increasingly crowded. Yes, it's true that technological innovation can greatly expand what can be done with a given quantum of spectrum. But there's a limit to how quickly we can invest and innovate. The amount of information flowing over some wireless networks has grown at over 250% per year. And by some estimates, the next 5 years will see an increase in wireless data of a factor of 20 to 45 relative to 2009 levels. Many other countries have less encumbered spectrum than the United States and continue to move aggressively in the wireless arena. China and Indian mobile phone companies are gaining between 8 and 10 million subscribers per month. To be sure, the United States has the edge in the ecosystem of networks, technologies, products, and applications. But we can only keep that edge if we continue to develop our digital infrastructure. These issues are fundamentally important for our competitiveness. We live in a world where skilled workers are increasingly mobile, where ideas are readily transmitted across international boundaries, where capital is ever more mobile, and where the ability of corporations to maintain their networks across international borders is continually enhanced. In such an integrating and ever more integrated world, as debates over everything from Buy America provisions to outsourcing to intellectual property illustrate, we have an ever-increasing stake in ensuring that even as the global economy becomes more integrated, the American government must pursue policies that are focused on American prosperity and whose benefits flow to American workers. Strengthening our infrastructure is such an approach. Infrastructure is constructed here in the United States by American workers. It cannot be relocated, and it draws mobile factors of production to our country to take advantages of the benefits it brings. If transportation infrastructure was and remains a key source of competitive advantage in the industrial economy, I would suggest to you that digital infrastructure will be a key source of competitive advantage in the knowledge economy. There is no step more important for the digital infrastructure than assuring that scarce spectrum is efficiently allocated. President Obama is today signing a presidential memorandum committing the federal government to the ambitious goal of making available another 500 megahertz of additional spectrum by the end of the decade, nearly doubling the total amount now available for wireless technologies. The substantial proceeds realized from this process will be invested in strengthening our public safety and investing in infrastructure that will further create jobs and productivity benefits. The President's plan has 4 components. First, identifying and planning for the release of 500 megahertz of spectrum. Doing this requires a 2-pronged strategy that focuses on the best available opportunities to free up both federal and commercial spectrum for new uses. The government will examine how we are currently using spectrum in the public sector and identify areas for improvement, consolidation, or sharing. To that end, we are pursuing a separate fast-track process to identify this year a down payment of specific bands of spectrum that can be freed up. Second, we will encourage commercial spectrum holders to avail themselves of opportunity to transition their uses if there are more efficient possible uses of their spectrum. While we go forward with this planning process, and as a crucial part of that planning process, the Department of Commerce and the FCC are conducting an inventory of spectrum use so as to inform potential end users of spectrum and improve transactions in secondary markets. Second component to the President's plan is to provide new tools and new incentives to free up spectrum. For commercial spectrum, the most important tool we need is incentive auctions, as the FCC has proposed. To that end, we will work with the Congress to develop legislation that provides the FCC with the necessary authority to conduct these auctions and enable current spectrum holders who participate in them to realize a portion of the proceeds. Because of recent advances in technology, there are instances where a local television station in a major city that has annual revenues measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars may hold a spectrum band whose value is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. New technologies can now support more than one high-quality signal in a space that could previously only fit one, enabling multiple stations to share a band of spectrum and free up an equal amount for other purposes. Realizing these gains will be the objective of our incentive auctions. To be sure and to be clear, our plan will allow all stations that currently broadcast the right to continue to broadcast. It is based on the principle of voluntarism. But if a station decides to share its spectrum or give up its license to broadcast over air, and it is a choice, there is a tremendous potential for new and highly beneficial uses. And there is an incentive for the station in question. Stations that volunteer to participate will receive a portion of the auction proceeds, even as businesses and consumers are gaining from faster and more diverse networks. Decisions about the use of the spectrum will not be made by government. Our role is simply to set up a mechanism that will help make everybody better off by, with compensation, shifting spectrum to its highest value use. Another opportunity to free up spectrum that I already referred to arises through more efficient use by the federal government. That's why the President is seeking broader tools to give federal agencies upfront planning and research funds and allow agencies to use a portion of the proceeds from freeing up their spectrum to adopt state-of-the-art communications. Third component of the President's program, redeploy the spectrum to high-value uses. Most of the freed-up spectrum will be auctioned off for use by mobile broadband providers. As Coase originally pointed out, auctions tend to ensure that spectrum is devoted to its most productive uses because those with the most productive uses will be willing to pay the most. Today, the use of the spectrum most in demand is for wireless broadband, which is growing at an exponential rate with the spread of smartphones, netbooks, and wireless-enabled devices. In the most recent auction held by the FCC, carriers were eager to snap up the available spectrum for this purpose, purchasing the right to use 50 megahertz of spectrum, 1/10 of the quantity of spectrum that we contemplate freeing up for almost $20 billion. We also recognize that providing unlicensed spectrum, free for anyone to use, has spurred considerable innovation, from Wi-Fi to cordless phones. Consequently, ours is not a market fundamentalist approach based only on allocations to those who are willing to pay the most. We are committed to making spectrum available for unlicensed uses by technology startups, end users, and others that benefit from low barriers to entry and quick time to market. At the same time, we are encouraging the government's R&D agencies to catalyze further innovations, such as spectrum sharing technologies that enable more efficient use of this scarce resource. Fourth, the government will use the auction proceeds to promote public safety and job-creating infrastructure investment. Spectrum is different than most of what is discussed in Washington budget debates. Usually offsets, measures that raise revenue, are measures that you do only because of the revenue they raise. Otherwise, they would have a negative impact or be at best neutral on the economy. Think of tax increases or think of reductions in government services. Unlike the normal case, this is the rare instance where the same act that raises revenue, auctioning off the spectrum to the highest bidder, also makes the economy function better. Spectrum auctions are a win-win-win policy 3 times over. They create prosperity and jobs, enhance our ability to compete internationally, and at the same time raise revenue for public purposes like improving public safety. At this point, we have no official estimate on the auction revenues from this plan. The actual amount will depend on effective implementation and on a whole range of design details. But based on past auctions, many analysts believe that the revenue potential could well reach into the tens of billions of dollars. We propose reinvesting these revenues in making America safer and in fostering additional economic growth. The idea that the same measures can enhance our national security and also promote economic growth is also not a new one. Remember that the highway program President Eisenhower established in 1956 was originally known as the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways to serve as an infrastructure both for commerce and national defense. In this same spirit, the first claim on auction revenues from the freed-up spectrum is to support the creation of a nationwide, interoperable broadband network for public safety, of the kind originally recommended by the 9/11 Commission. The long overdue shift to modern cellular systems for voice and data will both strengthen public safety and over time may actually save money. Even after this investment is made, we expect to have substantial remaining funds that can be used for deficit reduction and reinvesting in strengthening America's 21st century infrastructure. Take just one example. Today, our air traffic control system is based on the decades-old concept of radar. Vacuum tubes are still in use, even as most of the people in this room own cars with state-of-the-art GPS systems. Leftover proceeds from spectrum auctions could be used to enhance our efforts to bring our air traffic control system firmly into the 21st century, reducing delays, enhancing energy efficiency, and promoting air safety. What's at stake in all of this? Broadband and wireless communications make a critical contribution to the American economy. Consider what wireless has already contributed to our economy. Before the first spectrum auctions in 1993, 54,000 people were employed in the wireless industry. Today that number is 268,000. But they are just the tip of the pyramid. The Industry Association estimates that another 2.4 million American jobs are directly or indirectly dependent on the U.S. wireless industry. And just about every job everywhere benefits from mobile technologies through increased productivity and living standards. Economic studies have found that the introduction of 1G and 2G cell phones have generated $80 billion to $150 billion a year in lower prices and better products, funds that translate into increased buying power and increased demand at a time when our economy continues to suffer from high unemployment and excess capacity. 4G wireless technology promises to bring significant economic benefits in two broad categories. First, the substantial capital expenditures associated with developing 4G networks will generate significant job creation. Each dollar invested in wireless deployment is estimated to result in as much as $7 to $10 higher GDP. With major American wireless firms spending $10 billion and the figure rising on these efforts, the benefits for job creation and job improvement are likely to be substantial. Probably more important will be the effects on the larger economy. Number of mobile broadband users in the United States is expected to increase by 75% from 2009 to 2013. Combined with increases in speed and functionality, the economic implications are likely to be profound. My guess is that we can't really imagine what those implications will be. Even as people started to anticipate that there would be an internet, that the internet would be transformative, few, I would suggest, would have anticipated the 800,000 jobs that would be created by the eBay community. And few who knew about smartphones would have predicted the size of the thriving industry in the creation of applications. There are other benefits as well. As quality improves and prices fall, mobile broadband has the potential to help bridge the digital divide, reducing geographic and socioeconomic differences in broadband access to the much lower levels that we now see with television, landline phones, and mobile phones. Because wireless broadband is more cost-effective than terrestrial broadband in some rural areas, freeing up spectrum will enlarge markets and reduce costs, creating opportunities to expand broadband access to unserved areas. We will, as a country, only prosper in the years ahead if we have a strong private sector that is flourishing in the most important economic sectors. That is why the broad project of renewal in which President Obama is engaged is so profoundly important. It has many aspects: education, healthcare, energy, financial reform. It also has a crucial aspect around fundamental infrastructure investments. Each generation in the United States has bequeathed to the next something fundamental, something that was new and almost unimaginable when it was launched, but was taken for granted 30 years later. A 1-week crossing time from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A waterway connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific. The pervasive availability of electricity. The ability to drive rapidly and without traffic congestion or traffic lights between major American cities. The ability to communicate in a device that you held in your hands. It is a continuing American project, and our generation has its part to play. And that is why we are committed to doing what governments have always done, using that property of which it is a steward to drive the American economy forward. We've done it before. We will do it again with spectrum auctions. There will be contentious debates. There will be doubt debates about the proceeds. There will be debates about how the auctions are best carried on. There will be debates about who is entitled to what. There will be debates about what the definitions of the property rights are. Those are very important debates. But they are not debates that should take us away from the fundamental project of American renewal, where the proper management of this generation's crucial resource, the spectrum, is so profoundly important. Thank you very much.
If I can ask you, and also sorry, it's warm in here. I think we're just getting the air conditioning back on. We seem to have maxed it out. As we go to questions, I'd like to ask you, to please stand and and give your name and affiliation as well. And I think and wait for the microphone. And while that comes into the room, I guess I'll try to lead it off with one first question, if you'd like. That was a terrific speech, and particularly love the historical context. If I could ask you one thing about the you talked about the TV ban and how the incentive auctions may work to allow us to reorganize and repurpose under the National Broadband Plan as many as 20 more channels for broadband, which would be a good thing. At the same time, we're in the process of implementing a policy that opens unlicensed access to all of the vacant TV channels today, which are the majority of the channels, and that will tend to be disrupted if we move to auctions several years from now. So I'm wondering if the administration can give any assurances that as we reallocate TV spectrum, that a substantial portion will be unlicensed, so that the high-tech community isn't deterred in the meantime from R&D, from investment and deployment on the vacant channels today, which Google's Larry Page, for example, calls Wi-Fi and steroids.
One of the challenges, there's an enormous number of things that are very different about my current job as economic advisor to the president and my previous job as being a university president. Most things are actually very different. But there's one thing that's the same, which is that with very considerable frequency, you're called on to speak to an audience about a subject where the vast majority of the people in the audience know a great deal more about the subject than you do. This is one of those times. And there's a reason we had all of that stuff about history. And some of it was that I think it is very important in providing perspective on what we're doing. And some of it is that it was something I knew something about. And my lecturing all of you about the intricacies of spectrum really would be bringing coals to Newcastle. I think the best I can do for you is tell you that, as I think I indicated in my speech, we are very aware that what you might think of as frontier spectrum serves an enormously important purpose in catalyzing innovation, and would not want to do anything that would inappropriately impair that process. And there'll have to be a lot of judgments as to the pace and as to the scale of what's allocated, so as to make sure that the respective equities, the ones you describe, are respected, and also the legitimate equities of uses that generate market value are respected. I tried to organize my speech in a way that made clear that while we are mindful of the fact that there is revenue potential here, and that revenue potential is, frankly, given the catalog of national needs and the scale of federal deficits, not something that is insignificant or unimportant. We do not think of this as primarily being a cash cow policy. Yes, people pay tuition to the land-grant colleges. Yes, people paid to take the train across the country. But that's not why those things were important. And what's most important here is not some effort to grab revenue. What's most important here is to free up a resource so that it can find its way to its best uses. And I can promise you that while no doubt there will be participants in the debate who will mostly be looking for a cash source, that's not the perspective the administration will bring.
There's one coming right behind you.
Thank you. Mr. Summers, I'm David Goodfriend here to thank you on behalf of Dish Network, EchoStar, Sling Media, 3 companies that are spectrum constrained and are thrilled that the administration is taking this action today. We also believe that some very forward-looking policies of your administration have helped to spur investment and will continue to do so, namely the non-discrimination principles that went into the broadband grants. Prior to that, not your administration, but the C block that included non-discrimination principles. On the technology side, we think that's the kind of thing, as you said, spurs investment, creates jobs. Question is, do you agree, and if so, do you anticipate that the issuance of these new licenses would include such non-discrimination principles? Thank you.
I'm looking at a member of my staff before I...
It's historically been the FCC's call.
I'm going to leave that one. I think that he just gave me my out, which is since the FCC sets non-discrimination policies, I want to be careful about speaking for them, but we're certainly very mindful of the benefits that such non-discrimination policies have generated in the past. Yes.
Hi, Jeff Mervis with Science Magazine. I'm going to ask you a question that may be more in your ballpark regarding the impact on higher education. Specifically, the National Academies just began a study looking at the challenges facing research universities. And I wanted to know, with your perspective as a former university president, do you think the universities are currently prepared to take advantage of this increase in productivity that would come from this new opportunities for broadband? And if not, what do they need to do to better take advantage of what's coming down the road?
I guess I'd make 2 points. One is that I highlighted in my speech the idea that in a world where so much is mobile, competitive advantage can't really reside in an individual. It has to reside in something that's collective. That's why if you look at American universities and you look at the top 10 companies in any industry today and the top 10 companies a century ago, there's been nearly complete turnover. You look at the top 10 universities today and the top 10 universities a century ago, and the list is very, very close. Why is that? It's because strength for a university is that the faculty are coming there because of the students are coming there because of the faculty, the place has attracted good students, therefore it has successful alumni, therefore it benefits from its successful alumni, therefore it's able to attract great students in the future, and it's something that's enormously difficult to dislodge. And so the strength of our universities is an asset for the United States that is going to be much more difficult for other countries to dislodge than an asset that depends on a particular factory or a particular type of skill, precisely because it resides in something collective. That's also true of anything that represents a network, which is part of the reason why I'm here talking about the question of spectrum allocation. But it's something that's also true with respect to our universities. But precisely because our universities have the advantage I just described of that network and are natural leaders with staying power, the greatest threat to our universities is complacency and a failure to innovate, a tendency to stay with traditional organizational forms, traditional ways of doing teaching, traditional ways of doing research. And my hope would be that over time, the whole IT revolution would do more to change educational practice, to change pedagogy, to change the ways in which research are conducted. And my guess is that when someone looks back and sees who the leading American universities are in 2050, the changes between today and 2050 will have a great deal to do with which universities were facile and were bold in taking account of information technology. And the challenge for universities will be to maintain a bias towards innovation. I always said when I was at Harvard that the one thing I was certain of was that if we didn't try anything that failed, that would be the biggest failure of all, because that would mean that we hadn't taken enough chances and made enough attempts at innovation. And I think that kind of philosophy needs to be encouraged with respect to information technology in universities. Yes?
Jim Snyder from iSolon and the co-founder of the Wireless Future Program here at New America Foundation. My question is, will the administration commit itself to transparency and spectrum lobbying? As you know, the administration has its open government directive, strong commitment to transparency. Yesterday, the New York Times wrote about how the administrative officials are going to Caribou Cafe and other entities to avoid the disclosure rules. Recently, the FCC Chair Ganikowski was alleged to be meeting on network neutrality, one of the key issues for the FCC in private, very controversial, because it contradicted his commitment to transparency. But the biggest problem is at the NTIA with Larry Strickland. That agency takes the case, which is directly in charge of this federal spectrum that you're talking about. It has a long tradition of meeting lobbyists and accommodating them in secret. He's committed to transparency, but there's a long tradition of secrecy at that organization, and he just has not delivered the goods. If you want any more details in private, I would be happy to provide them. But will you commit yourself to more transparency and this vital, very
Tell you what. I have a suggestion. I think after I leave and go back to the White House, I think the New America Foundation should convene with the TV cameras here a summit of anyone here who's representing a company with you and those who share your views to discuss approaches to transparency. And just for the sake of it, it ought to be on television so that that discussion will itself be something that is transparent. In all seriousness, I have learned that the correct answer to all questions of the form, will you right here make a commitment on behalf of the administration to a sentence that I parse, is to not agree with the listener. So on absolutely general principles, there's no statement of the form, will you make a commitment on behalf of the administration, that I would answer yes. As to the values that are behind your question, I could not agree with you more on the importance of working to promote openness and transparency in government. That is something that President Obama has made clear is something he expects from all of those who are here. I believe I am the first of the people who have held my position who is in a position where anyone who comes to the White House to visit me that news is made available to a world 3 months later, and we will do our best to strengthen and to enhance transparency. And I can assure you that that is a commitment that President Obama expects from all of those who work in the administration. And while I don't know the details well enough to address anything that goes on at the Department of Commerce, I want to express my strong confidence in my colleagues who have worked on this and their commitment to the public interest and to the broad set of principles that the President has espoused. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Raghuveer Gaur from India Global Asia Today. Mr. Summers, being the Secretary of the Treasury and now advisor to President Obama, 20 major economies, including emerging markets, including India, met in Toronto. And Prime Minister of India met 3 times with President Obama in Washington, and now they also met in Toronto. So where do we go from Toronto, and also what role do you think India will play with the United States as far as future economies and emerging technology, science and technology, among other issues?
I think if you say the words information technology, democracy, English language, modernizing and renewing economy. You just say those words, you realize how much the United States and India have in common. You realize that a generation from now, they will be 2 of the 3 largest economies in the world. And I think we have an enormous stake in our relationship. And my hope it will be one of a deepening flow of everything, a deepening flow of telecommunications, a deepening flow of student exchanges, a deepening flow of tourism, a deepening flow of foreign investment, a deepening flow of international trade, a deepening flow of diplomatic contact to discuss the architecture of an evolving global system. I don't think there's any question but that the relationship with India is going to be one of the most important relationships for the United States over the next generation, and that's why we have invested heavily in that relationship, and certainly it's President Obama's intention to continue investing in that relationship. And back.
Thank you. I'm Mark McCarthy with Georgetown University. The Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission are thinking about what the proper role of government is to respond to the economic crisis and the production of news and public affairs. And one of their ideas is an increase in the flow of federal funds to local public media for the production of news and local news and public affairs. Isn't this an idea that should be part of the mix of what to do with the spectrum auctions as Congress considers legislation to authorize spectrum auctions?
I think it's an idea that needs to be fully thought through and assessed in terms of the need to support as vibrant a marketplace of ideas as possible on the one hand, and the need to be extremely careful about government involvement with media and its implications for press freedom on the other. And it seems to me that one wants to assess the right policy in those areas before getting into the question of what might or might not be an appropriate pay for. So I think that's a very, very important discussion and debate. It's not one that I have any great experience with, but I think the debate on what's necessary should probably precede any discussion of what possible funding sources would be if funding was decided to be in the general interest. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to sit away the TV camera. John Brandt, Fox News Channel. This sounds like the pitch is primarily as a jobs creation measure. How soon after allowing a spectrum auction would jobs go online? What kind of jobs would be online? And what are the prospects of Congress moving quickly to authorize spectrum auctions?
Well, first, I think of it as a stronger economy measure, and a stronger economy has the effect of creating jobs. Second, well before Congress legislates, and certainly before legislation goes into effect, the knowledge that spectrum is going to be available, and is going to be available on a larger scale, will spur all kinds of innovation activity today, will spur all kinds of production, will spur all kinds of thinking about applications, even before the spectrum becomes available. So I think of this kind of thing as a support for confidence in a key sector of our economy at the earliest possible moment. And so I would expect the benefits to start from today. This is complex, and those parts of the program that require new legislation, it will certainly take time. I hope it'll take place as quickly as possible, but it will not be a brief process. But again, there are benefits such as come from the fast track on identifying public spectrum that I think we can expect people will see quite soon.
I think this will be the last one because we're going to have to wrap it up since Mr. Summers needs to get back to the White House.
Harold Felt with Public Knowledge. First of all, I want to thank you for coming here to make this speech in the administration's policy, which certainly we've advocated. There needs to be a mix of approaches in this, and it's very good for us to hear the administration's emphasis on multi-part strategy rather than just one particular strategy. With regard to spectrum auctions, though, if I can risk boring people for a moment by asking an economics question. In Mexico, they recently revised the estimate for auction revenues downward because of concerns from potential bidders for an inability to break into the telecommunications market there because of the concentration problems there. Whereas in Canada last year, when they had a set aside for new entrants, they had an enormous amount of revenue generated in that auction. While I know that you say there shouldn't be a cash cow, do you think that the FCC, in making its determination, should look at the impact of competition policy and how strong competition policy may impact auction revenue?
I certainly, I'm going to give a short enough answer that I'll take one more question. But I certainly believe, and while I wouldn't want to speak for the FCC, expect that questions of competition policy will certainly enter into the design of any auctions that take place. Questions of competition insofar as how they affect how the auction functions, questions of competition policy insofar as they affect what the market structure will be after the auction has taken place, questions of competition policy insofar as they affect concentration, questions of competition policy insofar as they affect the competitive benefits that come from the possible expansion of incumbents' activities into new sectors. It's a complex area and a complex set of balances, and one that I know the FCC is determined to weigh very carefully in designing auctions. Take one more question. Yes.
Yeah. Cha Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. Director Summers, first, thank you for your coming. There's news that FCC going to propose release to have a 500 megawatts available next 10 years, and for the band between 225 and 3.7 available next 3 years. You mentioned the president initiative he signed today. Will this initiative will speed out this timeline? And what does internet ecosystem mean? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I think the fact sheet that I think you're quoting from does refer to the announcement that the president made today, and it's
so that's his timeline.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what's the internet ecosystem means?
I'm not sure I'm understanding. Perhaps you can pursue that with one of my colleagues.
Where's your colleague?
Who can? My colleague's sitting right in front.
Thank you.
Here, Mr. Weiser. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you. And we look forward to receiving your input and your advice as this policy process goes forward. Thank you.